I know that you have such a deep love for Lewis. You know, what we've been trying to think about is this idea of joy, this theme of joy in Lewis. And I said it's sort of a quad entendre because on the one hand, Lewis, as a little child, had this Sehnsucht, this longing for something that would satisfy him, this quest for joy. And so he was pursuing joy as a little boy, and then as he get a little older, we discovered last week, he gives himself over to atheism, but then joy is on the pursuit of him. And you'll recall we talked about Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien taking Lewis on a walk, about a mile-long circular walk, Addison's Walk at Magdalen College. I'm sure you've been there, John, many times.
Many times.
And they shared the gospel with him about the myth that is true, the myth that actually happened. Don't think of myth as something that is simply fabricated. It is a way of telling a story. It is a way of communicating true romance, true joy. But this myth occurred in time, space, history. And so that planted a seed. The Holy Spirit begins working. And do you remember when Lewis said he became a Christian? Remember, he wrote to his friend, Arthur Greaves, and said, I've actually become a Christian. When and where did it happen? Was it in some incredible, church sanctuary with a choir singing? Where was it? Do you remember? In the sidecar of a motorcycle with his brother Warnie. Warnie's driving the motorcycle. Lewis is sitting in the little sidecar, and he said, we left the house to go to Whipsnade Zoo, and when I left, I wasn't a believer in Christ, and when I arrived at the zoo, I believed in Christ. That was it. But the Holy Spirit had been working on him, wooing him to himself. So joy is pursuing him. And that's kind of where we pick up. And we're going to talk about joy tonight, particularly joy in the context of relationship, in the context of friendship, true Christian friendship. Let me ask you, what's your favorite sound? Okay, Sam, I'm going to ask you. There's probably only one right answer to this for you. What's your favorite sound?
Laughter.
Laughter. I thought you were going to say your husband's songs with him singing and playing. That too, right? Yes.
That's probably number one.
Can't be laughter.
Yeah, can't be laughter at that point. No. What's your favorite sound? What's just the sound that when you hear it, something just comes alive?
When the coffee maker goes.
The coffee maker. When the coffee maker in the morning goes off, then you know everything is going to be right in the universe, right? Coffee's a friend. It is. Chris, what's your favorite sound?
Sound of the forest.
The sound of the forest. That's a variegated sound. There are a lot of sounds in the forest. A couple others. Your favorite sound. You hear it, and it's just like cool water on sore feet. What's the sound you love?
Crash of a wave on the shore.
Crash of the wave on the shore. We were just down in Florida a few weeks ago, and we heard a lot of that. It is mesmerizing. One other. What's your favorite sound?
Orchestra tuning.
I'm sorry?
Orchestra tuning.
An orchestra tuning. Of course you're going to say that. That's an awesome answer. Doesn't surprise me coming out of you. I think probably all of us heard that. We're like, yeah, there is something strangely alluring about an orchestra tuning. My favorite sound is Gabby the Christmas cocker. I love it when she yawns, and she yawns really big, and then she kind of finishes her yawn with a little squeak. And she kind of only does it for me. I think she knows that's what I like to hear. She yawns and just kind of finishes it off with a little squeak to bring it in for a close. You know what C.S. Lewis's favorite sound was? Well, it's similar sound to what you said. He provided a little bio sketch for his publisher for the first American edition of Perelandra, which was the second of the Ransom trilogy. As you know, my favorite of Lewis's writings, along with A Grief Observed and The Weight of Glory and Silverchair. But the Ransom trilogy, the second, Perelandra, which Lewis considered among his greatest accomplishments in terms of literary styling, similar to the way he felt about Till We Have Faces. But Perelandra, he provided a little bio sketch for the first American edition for the publisher, and he said this about himself. I was a younger son, and we lost my mother when I was a child. You remember from the first night, we discussed that. That meant very long days alone when my father was at work and my brother at boarding school, alone in a big house full of books. I suppose that fixed a literary bent. I drew a lot, but I soon began to write more. My first stories were mostly about mice, the influence of Beatrix Potter, but mice usually in armor, killing gigantic cats, influence of fairy stories. That is, I wrote the books I should have liked to read if only I could have got them. That's always been my reason for writing. People won't write the books I want, so I have to do it for myself. No rot about self-expression. I loathed school. Being an infantry soldier in the last war, it would have been World War I, being an infantry soldier in the last war would have been nicer if one had known one was going to survive. I was wounded by an English shell, hence the greetings of an aunt who said with obvious relief, "Oh, so that's why you were wounded in the back." I gave up Christianity at about 14. Came back to it when getting on for 30, an almost purely philosophical conversion. I didn't want to. I'm not the religious type. I want to be let alone, to feel I'm my own master. But since the facts seemed to be the opposite, I had to give in. My happiest hours are spent with 3 or 4 old friends in old clothes, tramping together and putting up in small pubs, or else sitting up till the small hours in someone's college rooms, talking nonsense, poetry, theology, metaphysics over beer, tea, and pipes. There's no sound I like better than adult male laughter. Tonight we're going to fly over some of the most fruitful years of Jack's life, at least the earlier fruitful years, and especially drop in a little pub, 49 St. Giles Street in Oxford, where much nonsense and poetry and theology and metaphysics, beer and tea and pipes, and yes, laughter were given full expression. Friendship is a central theme throughout the work of Lewis. His best friend, as he admitted to the end of his life, was in one sense his brother Warnie. And so they were very close. They weren't the same in all respects, but they maintained a deep friendship. All the roads they had traveled since childhood, the sorrow and the loss that had forged a bond unbreakable. You may also notice over the last couple of times we've been together how often I've quoted from Lewis's letters on these Thursday evenings, and just how many of them were to his actual BFF, his true best friend forever, Arthur Greeves, 1895 to 1966. Their friendship lasted over 50 years, having begun on the same Belfast street when they were children. Now, C.S. Lewis, of course, is one of the world's most renowned authors. That's why you're here. I doubt any of you would have gotten out on a night like this with the weather for a fall-winter seminar on Arthur Greeves. Not out of disrespect, you just don't know much, if anything, about him. He lived a relatively unaccomplished life compared to Lewis and Tolkien and others. Yet had there been no Arthur Greeves, there would have been no Lewis, at least not as we know him today. Arthur was born to Joseph and Mary, not that Joseph and Mary, a different Joseph and Mary. He was one of 5 children. He wasn't a strong, robust young man. He had a congenital heart issue that kept him down much of the time. He had seen out the window the Lewis boys across the street there when they lived in Belfast, and he longed to meet them. He so wanted a friend, but he really couldn't get out and play and do much himself. But one day, Jack across the street had heard that his neighbor boy was sick. He wanted to go meet him and see how he was doing. And they met for the first time in 1914. He arrived only to discover Arthur propped up in his bed reading a volume of Norse mythology. Now, you remember we've made a lot about Lewis's love for Norse mythology and Tolkien's love for the same, how that brought them together. But he goes over to see this little neighbor boy that he'd never met before. He's sick in bed, propped up reading Norse mythology. Jack says, "Do you like that?" said I. "Do you like that?" said he. Next moment, the book was in our hands. Our heads were very close together. We were pointing, quoting, talking, soon almost shouting, discovering in a torrent of questions that we liked not only the same thing, but the same parts of it and in the same way. Lewis describes his friend Arthur Greeves. He was not a clever boy. He was even a dull boy. I was a scholar. He had no ideas bubbled over with them. It might seem that I had too much to give him, that he had nothing to give me. But this is not the truth. I could give concepts, logic, facts, arguments, but he had feelings to offer. Feelings which most mysteriously, for he was always very inarticulate, but he taught me to share. Hence in our commerce, I dealt with superficiality, but he in solids. I learned charity from him and failed for all my efforts to teach him arrogance in return. In a letter dated April 3rd, 1930, he wrote to Arthur Greeves and said, "You are my true father confessor." They shared their struggles. They shared their inmost thoughts. Later in life, May 25th, 1941, he writes a letter and he says, "I never pass a day without remembering you." Because you see, Jack, of course, had come to Oxford and Arthur stayed back in Ireland. You may have seen back here the 3-volume set of the letters of Lewis. They're together side by side. They're really pretty massive. 300 of those letters are from Lewis to Arthur Greeves. We have only around 4 letters that are extant from Greeves to Lewis. Not because he didn't write him, it's just that those letters have been lost. And the letters that we do have from Lewis to Arthur Greeves, Walter Hooper managed to obtain those from Arthur Greeves. He had kept them all those years, some 300 letters. Letter writing was such an important thing. Right? That's lost on us, isn't it? I mean, we send texts, and we don't even bother. You know, here's the thing. You know you are of a certain age if you use actual punctuation in your texts. I embarrass my kids when I send them a text and I use commas and semicolons and periods and that kind of thing. We send texts and we do it so quickly because we're quick and everything's quick and our relationships are quick. There was a time that letter writing meant so much. It wasn't simply a form of communicating the way that sending a text or an email is. It was a way of sharing who you were, of sharing, as Lewis says, the garden of your heart. And so he kept all of these letters. We have all of them now. You may recall also that Arthur Greeves was actually the very first person that Lewis reached out to and wrote to tell of his conversion to Christianity. And this is important because Greeves was a Christian whom Lewis attempted to win over to atheism in their early adult years. Greeves had been raised in the Plymouth Brethren Church. He left that, spent some time in the Church of Ireland. He dabbled in Baha'i. He dabbled in Eastern philosophy and thought for a while, only to return to his Brethren roots by landing among the Quakers. It also would appear that Greeves may actually have been a gay man. This didn't get in the way of their friendship, either before or after Lewis's conversion to Christianity. Jack believed throughout his whole life that sex was to be between a man and a woman, and the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman, and covenant of marriage for life. But he loved Greeves, and Greeves loved him. The last in-person meeting between Lewis and Greeves was at the Kilns in 1961. If you ever go over to Oxford, our friend John can take you there. He only lives 4 miles away from the Kilns. If I lived 4 miles away from the Kilns, they would have to call security on me. I'm sure of it. But he visited Jack at the Kilns in 1961. Lewis had hoped to get back to Ireland to visit Arthur until a heart attack in July, which presaged Lewis's death a few months later. And we'll be saying more on our last evening together before the Christmas break about Lewis's passing. But he wrote in September 1963, having just had his heart attack in July. Of course, he died. Do you remember when he died? November 22nd, 1963, the same day that Kennedy died and Aldous Huxley. And so he writes to Arthur Greeves in September of 63, and he says, "Oh, Arthur, never to see you again." He knew that he was never going to be able to get back to Ireland. Now, Greeves was not a part of the Inklings. We're going to talk about the Inklings tonight. He wasn't a part of the Inklings. There was, however, a friend Lewis would discover, and that famous literary club, an author renowned for his literary talent, would in fact constitute what he called his second friend. You see, Greaves is what Lewis described as a first friend. Not just like the first friend that you meet, but a first kind of friend. And this is what he says, okay? In the Four Loves, have any of you read the Four Loves? Okay. In the Four Loves, he says, a first and a second friend are different in this way. Greaves is what he calls a first friend, quote, an alter ego, the man who first reveals that you are not alone in the world by turning out. To share all your most secret delights. There is nothing to be overcome in making him your friend. He and you join like raindrops on a window. Did you have a friend like that growing up? I had a friend. My friend growing up, his name was Shorty Hunt. And we lived just a few doors down from each other, and it was kind of like that. There was no effort, there was no negotiating on what friendship needed to look like or be. We just collected action figures, and we played, and we traipsed through the woods around the house. We really were an inseparable pair. And so Lewis is saying Greaves was that first friend who lets you know you are not alone in the world. Now, again, he was not a part of the Inklings, but there was a friend Lewis would call that second friend, that second kind of friend. Again, a man of renowned literary talent who would in fact share with Lewis a love for poetry, language, myth, Norse legends, imagination. Of course, I mean, who are we talking about? Tolkien. No, Owen Barfield. I got a few of those little gotcha moments in store tonight. Owen Barfield, 1898 to 1997. He is, he lived, considerably into our own day, right? I actually have a friend who is a Lewis aficionado. In fact, he's the one responsible for me having that British first edition of Silverchair, because he collects and sells British first editions of Lewis. He actually has one of Owen Barfield's whiskey glasses. So it's very, very cool ephemera that he has there. But Owen Barfield constitutes what Lewis describes as the second friend, the second kind of friend. As Lewis says, who disagrees with you about everything. He is not so much the alter ego as the anti-self. Of course, he shares your interests, otherwise he would not become your friend at all, but he's approached them all at a different angle. He has read all the right books, but has got the wrong thing out of every one of them. Barfield and Jack met in the fall of 1919 while Jack was a student at Oxford, and Barfield was an undergrad at Wadham College. In his diary of June 28, 1922, Jack writes, Barfield towers above us all. Just his intellect, the scope of his learning, his articulation. He was an impressive man. 1923, Barfield becomes an anthroposophist. An anthroposophist. I don't know if you've heard of anthroposophy, which is a form of humanistic spiritualism. No external authority other than one's self. It's akin to sort of certain forms of New Age thought of last century. Interestingly, Carl Jung, an atheist psychologist, said theosophy, together with its continental sister, anthroposophy, are pure Gnosticism in Hindu dress. Interesting. So Owen Barfield is essentially a Gnostic mystic. But this began what Jack would describe as a decade-long great war between the two, who nonetheless remained good friends, as Barfield had to endure Jack as an atheist and then as a Christian. In 1925, Jack met another guy you may have heard of. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. Some guy named John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. 1893 to 1973. The first record of conversation between them was noted in Jack's diary of May 11th, 1926. Lewis joined Tolkien in these early years for the Coal-Biters Society. The Coal-Biters Society. And it was a group of literary nerds who would get together and they would devote themselves to the reading and discussion of Icelandic and Norse myths. Now, why were they called the coal biters? Because it was so cold there in Oxford that when they would build a fire, they'd have to sit so close to the fire they could almost bite the coals. So they called themselves the coal biters. And again, they existed to discuss Norse mythology. By 1929, they were regularly hanging out in Jack's rooms at Magdalen. Remember, he is an Oxford Don. He had a couple of rooms there where he could set things up. He would receive students, and it was almost like a little home away from home. Because, John, how far would it be from the Kilns to get to Magdalen College?
2 or 3 miles?
2 or 3 miles, and so he could walk it or ride his bike, but it would be a place where he could stay overnight, a place where he could have some of his library set up and teach there and receive students and so forth. And while they were there at the rooms at Magdalen, in Lewis's rooms, Tolkien would bring sheets of manuscript that he was working on. Of course, what do you think? See, now you're not going to play my game, are you? You're afraid. Because you want to say The Hobbit. But that's going to be wrong. And you're going to say, oh, it's going to be The Lord of the Rings. And it's actually the Silmarillion. That's what he was actually working on originally in its earliest draft forms, was the Silmarillion. And I wish we just had time to just get into Tolkien, but it's a rabbit hole that we would never come out of. But he would bring the sheets of these, draft manuscript chapters that he was beginning to work on. And actually, I have some pictures of some of the early drafts of the Silmarillion. There's the Silmarillion is actually over here. This is a kind of a decorative illustrated edition of the Silmarillion, and I have an American first edition back here. But these were just scraps of paper. Just written scraps of paper, and he would bring them and kind of read to Lewis what he was thinking, how he was beginning to sort of shape and form the Silmarillion. The camaraderie that Jack shared with Barfield and with Tolkien would eventually find itself the genesis of something filled with even more male laughter. Edward's Tanya Lean formed a group of literary dons and professors in 1930 called the Inklings, and these gatherings would take place in Lean's rooms at University College. When he left University College, the group disbanded. Inklings disbanded. But Jack swooped in and picked that fumble up and ran it in for a pick six. We are in the South. So John, what that means, that's a football analogy. Well, and you wouldn't even call it football. It's American. It's an American football analogy. But he picked up the name the Inklings, wasn't going to let it go by the wayside, and he simply moved the group, reshaped it a little bit in terms of its purpose. And so rising from the ashes, a new literary group of laughing, pipe-smoking professors, writers, and other interested parties would meet with Lewis in his rooms at Magdalen. The purpose of the group, again, was going to be shaped a little differently by Jack, as he loved to hear texts read aloud. For him, that was a way of memorizing. He memorized best by hearing texts read aloud, by hearing poetry read aloud. And so they would bring their manuscripts they were working on, their book ideas, etc., article ideas, different things, and they would read them and they would offer each other critique. And so the Inklings met Thursday evenings, starting in 1933 at Jack's rooms at Magdalen. They would also convene on some Mondays, but mostly on Tuesdays here at the Eagle and Child. So John, there's proof I've actually been there. That wasn't photoshopped. But they started meeting on Tuesdays mostly, sometimes Mondays, for lunch at the famous Eagle and Child, or the Bird and Baby, as they affectionately dubbed it. The pub goes back all the way to the 17th century, and its name derives from Homer's Ganymede, the most handsome of all mortals, who was lifted away by the eagle of Zeus when he was but a baby, so he could be taken away to serve the gods. In fact, if you go to the Eagle and Child, you'll see this sign hanging above the door of an eagle with a baby in its claws. This, of course, is the rabbit room. I may come back to that here in a second. I don't think I've got the other. I'll try to find the picture and put it up. There's actually a different sign at Lewis's house at the Kilns. I'll try to find a picture and put that up. But that sign was the original sign that hung here. This is the replacement sign. And the original sign had an eagle with a baby riding on the eagle's backs, kind of nestled between the eagle's wings as they are out flapping. And one can only wonder if that sign, in passing in and out through the eagle and child so many times, was the inspiration for that famous scene from The Hobbit, in which a giant eagle rescues Bilbo from the company of dwarves. You may recall if you've read The Hobbit. The story on that sign, I have a picture of me standing in front of the original sign at the Kilns, and Walter Hooper apparently was going by the Eagle and Child when they were doing a bit of a rehab many years ago, and they were going to replace the sign with a more colorful version with a new painting of an eagle carrying a baby. And the old sign, the sign under which Lewis and Tolkien and Barfield and Hugo Dyson had passed, hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of times going in and out for a pint of bitter, that sign was just leaning up on a fence nearby, and Hooper asked him, "What's going on with that sign?" And the man said, "Well, we're just going to throw it away." And he said, "You can't throw that away. What do you want for it?" And the man said, 45 pounds. And so he bought it, and now it's at the Kilns hanging up. And I got to get my picture made by the original sign that hung there. But in the Eagle and Child, there was a private room here. Maybe some of you, how many of you have been to the Eagle and Child? Okay, handful of us have been to the Eagle and Child. It's not open right now. It wasn't open when we were there last summer. I think it's going to be reopened and in a year or two, as I understand it. But in the back, and nestled way in the back, is a sort of a semi-private room called the Rabbit Room. The Rabbit Room, where our own Rabbit Room here in Nashville gets its name. Here the likes of Jackson Tollers, Hugo Dyson, who was a Shakespeare scholar, remember? Warney, Jack's brother. Colin Hardy was a classical tutor at Magdalen. Adam Fox was the Dean of Divinity at Magdalen. Robert Harvard, Jack's personal doctor, would show up. He was a medical man, but he was also keenly interested in literature and all things poetry and mythology. James Dundas Grant, an ear, nose, and throat surgeon, was part of the Inklings. Charles Williams, 1886 to 1945, whose work Lewis admired before they met. And Williams felt the same way about Lewis's work. And so in 1936, they sent letters to one another, letting them know how much they liked each other's books and, letting their mutual literary feelings be known. Well, by 1939, as the war breaks out, Charles Williams moves to Oxford to work for the Oxford University Press. And so it was only going to be natural for him to be invited by Lewis to join the literary lads at the Bird and Baby. The Rabbit Room was the sanctuary, wreathed in pipe smoke, wherein was heard the draft versions of these writers and others' works in progress. Warney was a writer. Warney was a writer. He read aloud his The Splendid Glory. Charles Williams read his All Hallows Eve, and Jack's Out of the Silent Planet, 1938, was read first, chapter by chapter in draft form here in the Rabbit Room. One of my favorite books I've ever had my hands on. His The Problem of Pain, 1940. The Screwtape Letters, 42. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe of 1950. I mean, can you imagine being there? Okay, can you imagine? Kathy, can you imagine you're sitting there, you've got your pipe in your hand, right? You got your pipe in your hand. You're smoking 3 Nuns tobacco. That's what Lewis smoked, right? The smoke's just billowing up. You've got your pint of bitter next to you, and you're listening to C.S. Lewis read the initial chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or you're hearing him read from Out of the Silent Planet. I mean, this is a heady situation. And again, there's a lot of laughter, a lot of friendship, a lot of sparring, a lot of critique going on. As we're going to see here in a second, that didn't always land well, this critique. Okay, so don't get the idea that when someone was critiquing another's manuscript or another's new chapter from a book they were working on, that they responded to one another. Well, that's a jolly good point, old fellow. No, there was a lot of sparring that went on and some hurt feelings that would arise. But and one of the funny things here, you may recall, I showed you this picture a couple of weeks ago when they would run out of beer at the Eagle and Child or the Bird and the Baby. They would run out of beer. The Inklings would all pack up and go kind of catty-cornered across the street to the White Horse, and because they had beer. And so that's me in my C.S. Lewis t-shirt. Nobody could guess who the tourist was that day. I'm very incognito, but I'm at the same bar that Tolkien would have ordered a pint of bitter as he read aloud drafts of The Lord of the Rings here at the White Horse. There's just not remotely enough time to say much more about the Inklings in general as a literary group, as I do want to leave enough time to talk about Tolkien's son Christopher here in a minute. Very important, and say a bit about the sometimes complicated relationship between Jack and Tollers. I would say for a little more information, if you want to go a little deeper, and Ken, you may have these books over there. I think this one may be out of print. The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield, and Charles Williams by the Zaleskis. And then I would recommend, if you want a little shorter, really, really well done account of the lives of the Inklings, Bandersnatch. Lewis, Tolkien, and the Creative Collaboration of the Inklings by Diana Pavlik Glyer. This is a great book. Ken, do you have that one over there? He's making a note right now. It will be here next week on it. So Bandersnatch would make a great Christmas present for yourself, right? You do that kind of thing? You get a Christmas present. I showed you my collection of the poetry of Tolkien back there, right? And I received it as a Christmas gift from a very, very thoughtful individual. Myself. Just put it under the tree and happy Christmas to me. But that'd be a great, Bandersnatch is a great, I think the other one may be out of print. I want to read just a little bit from this book, just very, very briefly. Now, this book I think is out of print. If you find a hardback on the used market, I saw one online the other day. This is C.S. Lewis Companion and Guide. I saw a hardback version of it for $150. Used paperback versions are about $50. I paid $2 at McKay's a few years ago. But Walter Hooper, and we'll say more about Hooper when we get to our last evening together, we wouldn't have Lewis were it not for Hooper, just as we wouldn't have Tolkien the way we have Tolkien if it weren't for his son Christopher. And I'll say more about that in a second. But Walter Hooper puts this book together, a little guidebook, handbook on Lewis. And I love some of what he says here about Lewis's character. This just really very, very touching, I think. So he's describing Lewis, really the man. I mean, he's saying this is what this book is going to be about. This is it's the way it's going to be laid out and so forth. Another reason for this companion is Lewis's popularity. And speaking of this, let us begin by noting that nearly all Lewis's readers mention prophetic as a particularly outstanding quality in his writing. And yet, if there is one way in which he was unprophetic, it was about himself. Now, you've heard me say that. Lewis was prophetic. For instance, I've talked about how, we're moving out now of postmodernism. I mean, to talk about postmodernism, I mean, that's like 1998, it's called wanting its worldview back. We're really now entering an age of metamodernism and transhumanism, where the question is, what does it mean to be human? But here's the thing, back in the 40s, Lewis in some ways prophesied where we are and where we're going now in that hideous strength. When he said the last aspect of nature that man will overcome will be human nature. And then the battle will be won. But the only question that remains will be who will have won the battle. Haunting, really. Prophetic in so many ways. And yet Hooper's saying there was one area where he was uniquely unprophetic. And it was about himself. Quote, I am going to be, if I live long enough, he wrote to a friend on 20th of December, 1951, one of those men who was a famous writer in his 40s and dies unknown. And yet, here y'all are, getting out on the coldest night in recorded history. A frozen tundra is what you encountered, and yet here you are. He asks, how could he have thought this about himself? The Narnian stories were only just beginning to appear, but some of his theological books were then, as now, among the most popular religious apologetics in Britain. I believe the best explanation for this lacuna, as a gap, in Lewis's makeup was provided by Owen Barfield. Do you remember Owen Barfield? Owen Barfield, who was a Gnostic pagan spiritualist, who said, what I think is true is that at a certain stage in his life, he deliberately ceased to take any interest in himself except as a kind of spiritual alumnus taking his moral finals. And I suggest that what began as deliberate choice became at length, as he had no doubt always intended it should be, an ingrained and effortless habit of soul. Self-knowledge for him, for Lewis, had come to mean recognition of his own weaknesses and shortcomings and nothing more. At best, there was so much else in letters and in life that he found so much more interesting. In other words, what interested Lewis was not himself, but his relationships and the truth that he had found in Jesus Christ. And it really is kind of that John the Baptist, I must decrease and he must increase. There was a certain liberty that he experienced in self-forgetfulness. It's really a beautiful thing. I would encourage you, this is a great book to have, but it'd be pricey if you find it on the used market. But I want to talk a little bit about Tolkien. Maybe can I get some coffee? Would you bring me some coffee up here, please? Thank you. Now, the Inklings, here's the other thing about the Inklings. It was a men's only club. Okay? It was a man's world. Oxford was a man's world. The Inklings, you remember the Little Rascals? You remember their club, the He-Man Woman Haters Club, right? And yet Buckwheat always, no, it wasn't Buckwheat, it was Alfalfa, had that crush on Darla, and Darla had a crush on him, right? The Inklings was a men's only club, but one might say, as we get ready to talk about a little bit of Lewis, you can just pour it right in there.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. As one might say, Dorothy Sayers was in some ways, is it happening? Oh, pay attention. Pay attention. It's time for us to talk about a little bit of Tolkien here. Oh, look out, it's coming. My precious. This coffee mug, right? Was that not the campiest segue you've ever seen in your life? I knew I was saving this for tonight. See, you're so jealous you knocked your own coffee mug over. He's knocking his coffee mug around, seeing if a ring will appear on it, right?
That's awesome.
Isn't that cool? This was a gift to me from Debbie Pixley a few years ago, and I absolutely. On the other side, it has yeah, a little Frodo.
That's awesome.
When you pour your hot coffee in it or your tea, the ring of power appears. It was a men's only club, but the relationship between Dorothy Sayers, 1893 to 1957, and Lewis, I think, in many ways makes her sort of a satellite member of the Inklings. She might be sort of an unofficial member because of a relationship with Lewis as well as with Charles Williams. She was brilliant. Again, Inklings, men only, but Sayers and Lewis deeply admired one another's work, and they were friends who enjoyed lively conversation and debate. Had it been up to Lewis, interestingly, she probably would have been invited in, just as his wife, Joy Davidman, would have been invited in. Tolkien would have had none of it. Tolkien would not have had, he would have had none of that. In fact, when Dorothy Sayers would come around and be around some of these men and try to sort of wedge her way in, because again, she was as brilliant as any of them were. But there's this one quotation where she interrupts the conversation. She says, "My goodness, is there anywhere around here that a lady can relieve herself?" I mean, it was such a man's world. There wasn't even a women's bathroom where they would convene and gather and so forth. But she's sort of a satellite member of the Inklings in some ways. They enjoyed lively conversation and debate, she and Lewis, and their number of letters back and forth. I have all the letters of Dorothy Sayers back here as well, and she is just brilliant and on par with any of these guys. Sayers especially loved C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters and the Ransom Trilogy, and she saw parallels between The Great Divorce and Dante's Comedy. Regardless of all that, the Inklings, I think we would be remiss if we didn't take a quick bit here to mention one of the later additions to this august group. October 1945, J.R.R. Tolkien invited his then 21-year-old son, Christopher, to join their club. He impressed it upon Christopher what an honor this was. This was no nepotism. Christopher belonged there. And as we're about to see, were it not for Christopher, we would have The Hobbit and we would have The Lord of the Rings, but the vast output of some 27 more volumes worth of Tolkien's manuscript materials that he found and straightened up and edited and compiled, we wouldn't have them. He was the primary reader of his father's manuscripts at these gatherings once he joined. And even before he joined, he would come and he would read because he had a good oratorical skill. Tolkien was actually not known for his sort of oratorical prowess. Jack was. Jack had a booming voice. Not so much Tolkien. In fact, I think what I'll try to do, I'm not going to have time to do it tonight because we've got so much to get through, but maybe next week I'm going to call up a video of J.R.R. Tolkien talking about the impetus for the Lord of the Rings. What's the Lord of the Rings actually literally about? What is the driving force of the Lord of the Rings? And it's about a 3-minute long BBC interview with Tolkien. You can hear him speak. He would mumble a little bit and so forth, and students were not always impressed with his lecturing the way they were with Lewis's, but Christopher would come, and because he was such a good reader, he would read and just captivate the Inklings with his readings of the draft manuscript pages of his father's literary output. Christopher actually passed away just a few years ago, 1924 to 2020. He spent the entirety of his life as the literary executor of his father's materials. And again, the main reason that we have what we have of Tolkien, so much of it, is because of Christopher. We wouldn't have his father's literary output were it not for his son's lifelong labor of love. From the Silmarillion, we wouldn't have that. The History of Middle-earth, which are several volumes back here, you can come see. Just take down the Funko Pop Lord of the Rings figures and you'll see the History of Middle-earth back there. He is the one who edited and compiled these things and saw to it that they would be published. Countless other books that were left in various levels of organized or disorganized manuscript form when Tolkien died in 1973. Now I think it's around 24 to 27 substantial volumes of unpublished material that were in the files in Tolkien's house, that he devoted the entirety of his life, his son Christopher, to making sure that we would have. Christopher was actually officially appointed the literary executor by his father and granted, quote, full power to publish, edit, alter, rewrite, or complete any of my works which may be unpublished at my death, or to destroy the whole or any parts of any such unpublished works. And so he gave us the Silmarillion. It's over there. There's a couple of other editions back there. He gave us Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that Tolkien had done early on and remained unpublished. Most all these are back there. Sir Orfeo, Nomenclature of the Lord of the Rings, which is kind of a guidebook to the language of the Lord of the Rings in 1975. a guide to the names of the Lord of the Rings, a Tolkien compass. In other words, several sort of handbooks on Middle Earth that he put together. Again, he gave us the pictures by J.R.R. Tolkien. That's back there as well. You didn't realize Tolkien was an artist. And he drew and sketched so many of the environs and the characters from Middle Earth. And Christopher collected all of these sketches and drawings. And that's a beautiful book that you can see back there. The Unfinished Tales, the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. I actually have a first edition of the letters of Tolkien, but now a new edition's come out. And you talk about a great Christmas present for somebody. Ken, turn it over to you. The letters of Tolkien. Show us that. That was your cue, man. That was your cue. The letters of Tolkien for the low, low price of I'm going to tell you straight up, that's a steal. That's a steal. There are two of them over there. Two of them over there. But The Monsters and the Critics and other essays, The Book of Lost Tales, Part 1, The History of Middle-earth, Mythopoeia, The Children of Hurin, Beowulf. He did a translation of Beowulf. Tolkien did his own translation of Beowulf. It lay hidden for decades until 2014. And that's back there as well. Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin. He gave us a lot of things in these recent years. I think knowing that his time was coming short, and there's just been this vast output of things that we never would have been able to get our hands on by Tolkien were it not for Christopher. He was awarded the Bodley Medal and the Bodleian Library's highest honor because of his editorial work on his father's work, his manuscripts, and because of his academic career at the University of Oxford. Now, two things to me are especially poignant when it comes to Christopher as a member of the Inklings, his work with his dad. And when we think about the love that a father has for a son, there is an April 30th letter, 1944, from Tolkien to Christopher. I love this. I don't want to get through it without crying because I think about my own son. J.R.R. Tolkien says to his son Christopher, 44. So again, what's he, 20 years old at this time? Right? He's 20 years old. So he writes him this letter, April 30th, 44. You were so special a gift to me in a time of sorrow and mental suffering. And your love, opening at once, almost as soon as you were born, foretold to me, as it were, spoken in words, that I am consoled ever by the certainty that there is no end to this. So my love for you, my son, just consoled. I'm consoled because I know there will never be an end of my love for you. Just a beautiful, again, the way that they laid their hearts out in letters, I think we don't do that in texts. We just don't do that in texts. We don't even do it in emails. Heck, we don't even read our emails, right? I mean, are you like, well, some of us here who struggle to keep up with your emails? But when's the last time you received an envelope with some folded paper and you opened it up and someone has taken the time to write their heart and just to share a note with you? Imagine Christopher getting this letter. You are so special a gift to me, he says. One of the things I love about the relationship between Tolkien as a father and his kids, you can see it. I collect editions of letters from Father Christmas, and I have a couple of others up in my other study up at the church. There's another edition over there. But I don't know, Ken, do you have any of these over here, the letters of Father Christmas? He's going to be making a note of that. Look at that. But it's basically every year Santa would write a letter to the Tolkien children, and Santa would also illustrate these letters. Let me find some good pictures here. He would also illustrate, because Santa would tell stories about how he had hired these polar bears to work for him, and I guess like in shipping and so forth of Christmas presents, and he would draw these pictures of the polar bears helping him out. Oh, here's a lot of the pictures here that were, it's beautiful end sheets there. It's a beautiful binding of a book, I think. But the pictures that he would draw in there, and then there was a story he told his kids about how the polar bears were supposed to help decorate Santa's house, and they made a mess of it, and they tumbled down the steps. And he would just captivate his children every Christmas with these letters from Santa Claus with these pictures that he himself drew. And so he was was a very sensitive and loving father. I think I may have shown you these things before. John, you'll probably recognize this. Is on Northmore. This is Lewis's house last summer. They were rehabbing and putting some new flooring in it. And I didn't think they were going to let us get near it. I mean, we're outside on this fence and there were workmen in there working with little front end loaders and different things. There's a lot of construction going on there. And I had a friend over there who lived in Oxford who basically pled our case and said to the foreman, look, these people have come all the way from Nashville, Tennessee. They just want to get a picture in front of the house. And to my surprise, he said, come on in. And so we got to go into a live construction site. And we walked in and I'm standing here. They were doing some new flooring in this room. But the reason that I'm peering in with bated breath is because on the other side of this door was Tolkien's study, wherein one evening as he was grading student papers, bored with grading, he flipped one of the papers over and on the back of the paper an idea occurred and he wrote the furtive sentence, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And the rest is history. Happened in that room that I'm looking into right now. The relationship between Jack and Tollers was not the making of a Hallmark movie. All right, I'm just going to tell you, it really, there was some tension at times, and we're gonna see here when we get next week to Jack's marriage to Joy Davidman. This put a real strain on Lewis's relationship with Tolkien. Also, the fact that C.S. Lewis remained Protestant, never converting to Roman Catholicism. That also was a pebble in Tolkien's shoe for the entirety of their relationship. And I think there was some sense of a certain kind of envy, perhaps, on Tolkien's part, given how Jack's fame surged as things like Narnia and Screwtape caught hold on both sides of the Atlantic. Their personalities as authors also differed considerably. Tolkien was meticulous to a fault, detail-oriented in the extreme. He could say in 30 pages what Jack could say in a paragraph. I'm not kidding. You know, that's one of the things, like, you know, you get people who are like either Tolkien fans or Lewis fans, and the Tolkien fans are always the snooty ones. Typically, they're the snooty ones because there's just such loquacious verbosity with Tolkien, and yet it's a rabbit hole. I mean, you can't not like it. You start reading and he describes a leaf on a tree and every vein in that leaf, and pretty soon you're like, this is the most amazing thing I have ever read. I didn't know I was interested in a leaf, and yet here I am staring down this bottomless well of description about a leaf or about a particular piece of landscape or something. You're just very, very detailed, very, very meticulous in a way that Jack wasn't. Jack was a little more of a situational writer, and he was writing variegated styles and genres, as you know. So Tolkien was meticulous to a fault. It took him, are you ready for this, some 17 years to write The Lord of the Rings. Yeah. And some of you may be thinking, yeah, it's taken me 17 years to get through it. Whereas Jack cranked out 7 installments of Narnia in 7 years, one a year. Tollers thought Narnia was this sort of disjointed claptrap, he called it. You may have used that word before, claptrap. What is claptrap? Just kind of, you know, low level kind of nonsense, you know. It seemed nonsensical to Tolkien, Narnia. And let's cut him a little bit of slack. We're going to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe over the break. Then we're going to come back. I'm going to give you some homework when the break happens, a couple of things to watch, and you're going to have kind of a Lewisian Christmas. We're going to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But if you've already read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when you first read it, was it strange to you when, like, you're in Narnia and, like, out of nowhere, who shows up? Santa Claus. You remember that? And you're like, wait, what? Is this like one of those, like, you know, holiday specials that come on, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? You thought you were watching The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and here, or you're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Good old St. Nick shows up. And that just drove Tolkien crazy. Because if Tolkien had been writing a story, look, Santa Claus never would have showed up in Middle Earth, number one. He wouldn't have had it. But had Santa Claus shown up in Middle Earth, you would have had like 3 chapters of description of the sleigh and the coat and the bag of toys. You would have been prepared about 3 chapters before for the coming of jolly old St. Nick. But you're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and just out of nowhere, here's Santa Claus. And so that just drove him crazy. Well, in our final session, I'm going to set you up to read Narnia, to read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Then when we come back next year, we'll do a couple of weeks, kind of an overview of Narnia. I'm going to set you up so that you can understand why Santa Claus shows up in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There was what we'd call an Easter egg. If any of you play video games, you know that video game makers will put Easter eggs along the way. You got to find them. You got to open them. They give you clues about what's to come. There's actually an Easter egg embedded in all 7 of the Chronicles of Narnia that bind them all together. Again, for Tolkien, Narnia, it just seemed disjointed. It seemed kind of higgledy-piggledy. He didn't know what to make of. How does all this hang together? And you got Santa Claus showing up out of nowhere. But there was an Easter egg, as it were, a thread that ran through all of the Chronicles of Narnia, binding them all together. And it was not, Jack took it to his grave. Tolkien couldn't even figure it. He just dismissed it. This is disjointed. How do these even hang together? It's this claptrap, he called it. And Jack took the secret to his grave, and it never became public until 2010. I'm going to introduce you to the work, if you're not already familiar, I'm going to introduce you to the work of Dr. Michael Ward, and I'm going to send you over the break to watch a video by Michael Ward, and that's going to kind of help us make sense of this. But Tolkien said that Narnia was, quote, outside the range of my sympathy. The next time somebody does something you don't like, if you really want to drive the point home, okay, so Sam, let's say, I know this would never happen, but let's say Will writes a song and you're not really keen on it. You're like, man, you can do better. What you need to say is, Will, sweetheart, that's outside the range of my sympathy. All right? So if she ever says that to you, you'll know. So Tolkien says Narnia was outside the range of his sympathy as much as my work was outside his. Tolkien didn't get Narnia. Lewis was not always enamored with hobbits. At least that was Tolkien's impression. I don't think that was actually true. He said that Lewis's, quote, letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, was a distressing and in parts horrifying work. Don't know. If he writes a song and wants to preview it for, do not say it's distressing and at points horrifying. Don't say that. He felt that C.S. Lewis's writing overall was, quote, creaking and stiff-jointed. Kind of like I am when I wake up in the morning. But Lewis complained that Tolkien was a perfectionist and was not open to anyone's advice. He said that the very mention of criticism of something Tolkien had read or had written would send Tollers into a spin, would lock him up in another long revision process, delaying his output. Again, remember, Narnia, 7 years. Lord of the Rings, 17 years. Jack said of Tollers, in the course of which so many new ideas occurred to him that where his friends had hoped for the final text of an old work, they actually received the first draft of a new work. So they're waiting until the next gathering of the Inklings, hoping that they're going to receive the final chapter, this final finished draft of something, and they come back, and what does he have but the beginnings of a new work? And he was just this perfectionist. And I think one of the things probably that was a point of tension between Tolkien and Lewis was Tolkien couldn't quite get his head around how quickly Jack could write and publish. Because remember, Jack is publishing not just Narnia, but he's publishing works of theology and even Bible commentary, reflections on the Psalms. He's publishing works of nonfiction, literary criticism, any number of things. And he's just cranking this out. And there probably was a bit of, I don't know, frustration that he couldn't crank things out like that. And so it was easy at a certain level to say, well, this is, stiff jointed and creaky, and he's writing too much, he says. He's just too much writing, he needs to slow down. And yet you see there's a difference, that meticulous, detailed, painstaking work is why you read Lord of the Rings once and you finish and you're like, I am going to read it again. I mean, I don't know if, maybe you would say, no, I tried to get through it and I can't. But are there any of you in here who said, I read Lord of the Rings through, and when I finished, I knew at some point I was going to have to go back to Middle Earth? Any of you? Yeah? Tolkien was somewhat critical of the pace that Jack would crank out Narnia, with which he was less than impressed, as well as works of Christian apologetics, which was not his forte either. Allegory of Love, Surprised by Joy. In 1967, 4 years after Jack died, Tolkien admitted, to tell you the truth, Jack never really liked hobbits that much. I don't think that was the truth. I'm going to prove it here in a second. But I think it may have been Tolkien just trying to say, well, I didn't like what he wrote, and he didn't like what I wrote either. Again, I think the only thing we can ask, competition much? That said, aside from their jousting, it was Tolkien who ensured that Jack's first book of Christian apologetical science fiction would find a publisher, Out of the Silent Planet. And so we have the Ransom trilogy. It's my favorite. If you've read it, you know that Ransom, the main character, is what profession? Philologist. I knew you would answer it, Isaac. A philologist. Whom do you think was the inspiration for that? Tolkien. Lewis based his character, Ransom, on Tolkien. And he writes, Ransom, after returning from Mars to Earth, spoiler alert, Ransom, after returning from Mars to Earth, immediately sought out a neighborhood bar. A lighted door was opened. There were voices from within, and they were speaking English. There was a familiar smell. He pushed his way in, regardless of the surprise he was creating in the bar. A pint of bitter, please, said Ransom. Their friendship inspired Lewis's chapter on friendship in The Four Loves. As they discussed literature and their dissatisfaction with much of what was being written in those early years of their friendship, Tollers once said to Jack, if they won't write the kind of books we want to read, we shall have to write them ourselves. Tolkien said that he would try his hand at a book on time travel, and Jack said he would take up space travel. Hence, Ransom was born, and of course there is a sense in which Middle Earth is a kind of time travel. Treebeard, one of my favorite characters in Lord of the Rings. In fact, Treebeard is over here. This is one of my prized possessions. Look at this. This is Treebeard, or Fanghorn, as he is called. He is from the forest of Fanghorn, down near the southern tip where the misty mountains are, as you know if you've read it. Fanghorn had this bellowing voice that was inspired by Lewis's bellowing voice. Lewis's booming, arresting, oratorical voice that could pack out lecture rooms in a way that Tolkien's voice couldn't do. And yet, Treebeard's oratory is kind of a tribute to Lewis. And so they would pay one another these little tributes and honor one another in those ways. Treebeard, right, was 14 feet tall in the book. It's incredible. Speaking of Lord of the Rings, we wouldn't have the Lord of the Rings were it not for Jack, whose enthusiastic encouragement in those pipe-plumed gatherings in the rabbit room telling Tollers to keep going, don't quit, don't give up. Tolkien said that Jack always wanted another story, and so he just kept writing new chapters of the Lord of the Rings to keep Jack quiet. And so we have, the greatest book outside the Bible possibly ever written. You see, about the time of Jack's conversion, Tollers began his story, The Hobbit. Again, where I was. So around the same time that he was sharing the gospel with Lewis, around, those same, years there, about, 4 or 5 years afterwards, he starts writing The Hobbit. That children's book met with enough success that Tolkien's publisher, Allen and Unwin, wanted more. Pretty solvent project and made a little money, and they wanted more. So in 1937, he began a more detailed, more sophisticated, more profound story of Middle-earth, and he wrote the first chapter in a month. Quite unusual for him. Then he began driving with his parking brake on for the next 17 years. There would be a hobbit named Bilbo with a ring, but he didn't know how to develop it. He didn't know how to sort of unpack it and work it out. And so one time the Inklings were gathering, and Owen Barfield, remember Owen Barfield, he was talking about his new play that he had written based on the story of Orpheus. Jack was critiquing some of what he was reading and interacting with it. Again, they all love the old Norse myths and Greek legends. Lewis told Barfield someone should write a new, updated version of the old Norse story of the Ring of Nibelung. And Tolkien had exactly what he needed. Bilbo's ring would be a ring of power forged in the fiery depths of Mount Doom by Sauron, who aimed to rule the world with it. And when Lord of the Rings was published, Lewis extolled its worth, describing the Lord of the Rings as only Lewis could. I love this as we come in for a landing here. This book is like lightning from a clear sky, as sharply different, as unpredictable in our... You know what? I shouldn't be the one reading this. I shouldn't be the one. You know who should be reading this? John. I think you're right. What do you think? They wanted John to read this? Okay, so here we go.
Want me to stand up?
Yes, I want you to stand right there. And so what you're going to read
In
is...
English.
Yes.
Proper English.
Or Elvish. You can read it in Elvish if you want. But the red part there.
This book is like lightning from a clear sky, as sharply different, as unpredictable in our age as Songs of Innocence were in theirs. To say that in it, heroic romance, gorgeous, eloquent, and unashamed, has suddenly returned at a period almost pathological in its anti-romanticism is inadequate. To us who live in that odd period, the return, and the sheer relief of it, is doubtless the important thing. But in the history of romance itself, a history which stretches back to the Odyssey and beyond, it makes not a return, but an advance or revolution, the conquest of new territory.
Oh my goodness, wasn't that fantastic? Wow. I suddenly feel strangely inadequate to keep talking. Thank you, John. That was truly lovely. That was truly lovely. You need to stay longer and just come over to my house. I just want you to read C.S. Lewis to me. You can just read to me. Lewis writes a letter to a friend in which he said he hoped Tolkien's book would usher in a new age. The Lord of the Rings is always on the top of every list of the greatest books ever written. I took this picture at Blackwell's bookstore in Oxford last summer. This is a first edition, second impression, right here. The first edition, second impression. December 1954. It was originally first edition, what we call a true 1-1. A first edition, first impression was in July of 54. December of 54 is when this was done. It's a second impression. If you're over there and you've got an extra 20,000 pounds, it can be yours. Right now, you can actually go online and get a 1-1, a first edition, first impression from July, if you have an extra $200,000 laying around. There is a first edition seventh impression. That means a first edition seventh imprinting, which would have been done in October of 57. So it's a true first edition, but it's just a later impression of that first edition, October 1957. for $100,000 at Moon's Books out in Utah. I think, well, wait a second, Dave. Wait, that's a 7th impression. I could understand maybe if it was a first edition first impression. Why is a first edition 7th impression out at Moon's Books in Utah $100K? Why do you think that might be? It's signed by Tolkien. So drop your hints. There's still 3 shopping weeks until Christmas. You could have something like this under the tree waiting for you. In ways, Tolkien surpassed Lewis's literary fame, as you know. However, Lewis's fame was variegated: poetry, fiction, science fiction, Narnia, literary criticism, apologetics, theology, Bible commentary, the list goes on and on. As we process through in our story of Lewis, the pursuit of joy, we've considered his childhood, in his early years, his longing for joy, the Sehnsucht, that sense of longing. We've considered how joy, true joy, a person who is himself joy personified, Jesus, pursued him from Addison's Walk. Jesus even rode with him in a sidecar on a motorcycle going to the zoo and laid hold of him. That same joy animated his friendships and his storytelling. And that joy is going to spread from his pen as his fame takes hold on both sides of the Atlantic. We're going to consider that next week. But in fact, his renown, his real fame strikes its first unavoidable chord, both here and there. His fame reaches a point of no return, not with literary masterpieces like Perelandra or Till We Have Faces, but with a book that admittedly is not his most poignant prose. And the name of that book is, you're going to have to come back next week and find out. I do that to you every week. Some of you can probably guess which one I'm talking about. In preparation, though, for next Thursday, here's what I need you to do. Go ahead and read The Weight of Glory. Okay? You don't have to read the whole book unless you're just eager. But the sermon, The Weight of Glory. For the remaining 2 sessions, I'm going to give some more lecture, tell the story of Lewis's life, especially his marriage and so forth, and the grief that ensued Joy's death. But for the remaining 2 sessions, as we prepare for the Christmas break, I want to treat part of our sessions as kind of like an Oxford tutorial, wherein we'll have a guided discussion of a couple of texts, but you need to do the reading so that we can really learn from each other. So go ahead and in prep for next week, read The Weight of Glory. I'm going to talk John into staying with us for another week, and he will read the entire sermon to us, all right? You heard it here first. But if you really want to get started, go ahead and start reading A Grief Observed. It's a small little book. It's a book that has sustained me through incredible sorrow and heartache and loss and suffering in my own life. It's a small little book. Go ahead and start reading it now, and you'll be finished with it in time for 2 Thursdays from tonight, and that'll be the book that we consider. So again, what we're going to do is the next 2 sessions, kind of probably the last 30 minutes of our last session, I'm going to kind of gin you up for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and send you home over the break to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then when we come back, we're going to start back up in February, and we're going to take time looking at Narnia for a couple of weeks. We're going to look at the Ransom trilogy for a couple of weeks, and Mere Christianity. And I'm going to tell you the story a little bit next week around how Mere Christianity came to be, but we'll look at it more in depth after the turn of the year. So if you want to go ahead and put those books on your Christmas list, you could start reading those things. In fact, I can't think of anything, any way you could better spend your Christmas break than reading the Ransom, I started to say Wansom trilogy, like Elmer Fudd. Elmer Fudd read the Wansom trilogy. You're going to read the Ransom trilogy. But anyway, go ahead and get those books, start reading, and I'm going to let you out just a little bit early. It's bad weather out there. I can't thank you enough for coming tonight. Thank you all for being here. And can we hear it for John and his beautiful reading? Can we hear it? Like Dodo being with us, and a new believer in Jesus. I love that. We're so glad, Dodo, that you're here. And then Lynn and Peyton are with us back there from Ohio. Look, I know it's impressive, Columbia and Hendersonville. It really, on any normal night, Columbia and Hendersonville would be really an impressive thing. It really is, but I mean, Oxford and China is incredible. Anyway, I'm so glad all of you are here. I really am. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week. Please be careful going home tonight. Come see Ken. He has some wonderful selections out here for you. I want you to go ahead and make your way over here and pick you out something nice, okay? Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for Joy himself, who pursues our hearts daily, who is himself the cream of all our pleasures, as Jonathan Edwards would say, the only one who can truly satisfy the Sehnsucht with which we were created, that longing for satisfaction and joy. Lord Jesus, I pray, be that for us. Let us not, as Lewis says, be like an ignorant child, satisfying ourselves, making mud pies in a ghetto, not knowing the meaning of an offer of a holiday at the sea. Lord, I pray this Christmas, this Advent, even as we prepare for a couple more weeks, thinking about Lewis before the break, would prepare our hearts for a holiday, as it were, at the sea. Lord, as we pursue you, the one who first and always ever pursues us. We ask all these things, Lord Jesus, in your precious name. Amen. All right, y'all. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for bearing this frozen tundra and making your way here. It's just incredible. I thought it would be 2 or 3 of us, so thank y'all.